Hi guys, thank you all for attending this webinar on how SMEs can prepare for a new normal post-COVID-19. We'll be taking some questions from you guys throughout the webinar, so please add those questions into the chat icon over there on the right side of your screen as you have them. Peter has graciously offered his expertise here, so be sure to test him. Also, if anyone has experienced connection issues, please refresh your browser. This software works best on Chrome from a laptop, so if that's possible, please use those. And obviously, the two of us are at the mercy of connections and bandwidth at the moment too. So if either connection drops, we'll take a short break to resolve it. So sit tight, but hopefully that won't be needed at all. So I guess, Peter, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, give a bit of detail about your background, and the floor is yours.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me fine. So firstly, I would just like to thank my colleague, Karmit Flick and Kogaport for having me on. These guys are doing an amazing job creating an ecosystem of information and knowledge exchange, especially in a difficult time like this. So keep up the good work. My name is Peter, as Corey has introduced already, and I lead consulting and business development engagements for a UK-based boutique practice servicing global clients. So our practice focuses on two primary areas. One is finance advisory, which is specifically mainly around accounting and reporting for asset and investment managers and their portfolio companies. And the other, which I lead, is the consulting and business advisory. So my primary focus area is around strategy and growth, M&A integration, and business transformation. We're also trying to start up and launch an investment side, which will be focused on development debt, business and asset finance raising, and things like that. So I guess the summary of our practice is we're more of a horizontal consulting practice. So a lot of what we do is more functional than industry focused. So we're industry agnostic, but we have expertise in professional services, real estate, recently private equity, and technology. You asked about my background. My background is mainly strategy and operations, so business analysis, because I spent a number of years at Deloitte working on implementation of several strategic M&A projects. So that's me in a very big nutshell.
I guess strategy and operations is a super interesting place to be in right now. I guess, given that, how are you feeling about what is going on currently, the elephant in the room, and how it's affecting the global economy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, the first thing I would like to say, and it's kind of my mini rant. I've had this with quite a few of my colleagues on WhatsApp or in our chats, and we have to remember this is not a financial crisis, right? This is not a debt crisis, and this is not the stuff that happened 10 years ago, the last recession that decimated the economy. Well, at least it's not at the moment anyway. So all the stuff that you're hearing around GDP contraction, the amount of job losses that we are going to potentially experience, all the stuff you're hearing about when the economy is ready to reopen, I just think it's nonsense personally. This is a health crisis, right? And that's the bottom line. We've never faced this in recent times. I think the last time we had anything this major, not in terms of number of deaths, and I hope it doesn't get there, but in terms of scale as a global pandemic, was after the First World War, right? Almost 100 years ago. So a lot of answers, we have to accept there's a lot of answers we will not know until years after this disease. For example, do you develop immunity when you contract the virus, or can you asymptomatic cases contagious? What is the true fatality rate? How far are we from finding a cure for this virus? I know I've read some news recently about Gilead Science on the verge of finding something, but even then, the usual get to market cycle for a new drug is about 18 months. And then you have the different response rates of different countries, different continents at different phases and stages in this viral attack. So how would that play out? But I think holistically, I mean, I'll share a little graph or presentation that I put together. So just let me know when you can see it.
Great.
But just to give some perspective, can you see?
Yeah, that's good there.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, this is a chart of U.S. layoffs so far, initial jobless claims, right? So in the last 3 weeks, we've lost about 16 million jobs, right? In 3 weeks. That's never happened before. Even the last recession, as you can see, the last recession was nowhere near a million, and it took many months for us to get to that level of economic deleveraging. Look at the contraction across various industries, apart from legal. I mean, lawyers tend to do well in every situation anyway. Apart from legal, software and IT services, everything is under immense pressure, and this is only the start of it. I'm sure a lot of you have heard recently that U.S. oil traded in negative territory for the first time, which has never happened before. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Now you have highly levered companies in the EU who are contracting significantly, but you have to remember that the contraction puts these companies within a very high chance of credit default. And once you start having those financial deleveraging, it's obviously going to put pressure in the economy, and then we could see worse situations that we're seeing now in terms of people's livelihoods and jobs. Look at the UK deficit, for example. The financial crisis before was about 10% of GDP. Now the projection is going up to almost 15%. That was the original budget forecast, which was the yellow line. So who's going to pay for this scenario of getting up to 15%? I mean, we had austerity in the UK. I live in the UK, so I'm speaking more closely about that, even though I follow other markets. But who's going to pay for all that? It's taken us almost 10 years just to get back to where we were as a percentage of GDP spend, and now we're about to balloon that again. I'm going to skip this, and maybe I'll just finish on this one. The debt burden, the black line represents the last financial crisis, and look at the debt burden we're potentially going to see just to fight this virus that we still don't know where the bottom is. We still have so many unknowns. So the point is that there's so many different moving parts, right? You have geopolitical tensions, China and US trade, which is taking a backseat at the moment. You have the oil collapse, which I've just kind of touched on very briefly. You have companies already going under. We've had Warehouse and Oasis go under. I was watching the news yesterday, and I saw Richard Branson pleading to the government to try to step in for Virgin. Then you have the big elephant in the room, which is how are people going to behave in this new normal? How are consumers going to behave and interact with the new world around them, from travel to leisure to real estate, retail to hospitality? So, I don't want to paint like a super gloomy picture, even though it comes across as that's what I'm primarily doing. But ultimately, if I was to summarize, you can't have a healthy economy or a healthy business without healthy people. And that's just my view. So I think we need to let the medics guide us. The good news is we're seeing coordinated fiscal and monetary policy across the globe. So my only worry is that who's going to pick up this economic and societal bill at the end of all this?
Do you have any initial thoughts on who that might be? The taxpayer, I guess.
Yeah, well, exactly. The people watching this.
Yeah. I mean, you also, I guess. So I guess in light of this reality of the new normal, or let's say, what we're facing now, what, in your view, do you think SMEs can do to protect their businesses now and to prepare for this new normal that we expect to face after this initial health crisis has passed and the economic situation is left to be picked up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, right? So I've thought about this, and I've had multiple conversations with people, because perhaps some of the playbook that we've had before may not be applicable in a time like this, right? Because one of the things that the government is pushing is, and also industry leaders are pushing, is try to keep the connection between businesses and employees, right? That bond, then getting back online would be a lot more difficult, right? So this is not a traditional crisis in the sense that, we've run out of ideas in terms of innovation, or we've just taken on too much debt and companies have had to go under because we've had a dip in terms of growth. This is actually a case of we've been told to stop working, right? That's what we've been told. So the hope is that when we switch that tap back on, it's easy to just switch as many things back on as possible, even though it's impossible to switch everything back on. So what I would try to do is take experiences from other people as well as myself, and I'll focus on like the top 5 things that from interviews and conversations that I've had with like business leaders, CEOs, CFOs, and consultants as well. And I've spoken to about 20 or 30 in the last month or so. But the first thing is number one priority, and I'm sure you guys have heard this before, is focus on your cash flow, right? Cash is king, and liquidity is the name of the game. So what does that mean? Like, you have to get good at managing your cash and your financial risk. So that involves improving your forecasting. A lot of people are saying you should be doing this on a daily basis, which is fine. I think if you do it very good and well on a weekly basis, you catch the daily holes anyway. But as well as your monthly and your quarterly forecast, it's important to understand how your cash is moving through your business, right? Do scenario plannings for all eventualities, like variance and sensitivity analysis for your base case, your worst case, and your best case. Where you can, extend your credit lines, even if you don't need it right now, just take it. It's there. The government is helping people. Banks have an incentive to help people. As I mentioned before, there's a coordination in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. So that's rare. We haven't seen that in recent times. Get rid of underperforming assets and protect your revenues, but forget about revenue right now. Just, what I would say is don't think P&L, just think cash. I want to hold on to my cash as much as possible. Something else as an extension to that is maybe watch closely your payables, right? So how are you managing your suppliers and your creditor base? And what is your plan if your supplier essentially folds? And a supplier that is required and essential to your value system, what happens if they fall over? How do you plan to prop them up? You need to build that into your base case and your worst case. Step in for this supplier. If not, your value system gets disrupted, right? So that should be factored into your cash flow forecasting. The other thing that I was speaking to a manufacturing business owner recently was about being prepared, right? You have to have a business continuity plan. He was saying to me that from his perspective, they were kind of lucky because they had clients who put pressure on them even before all this happened, because the B2B business, to say, if a plane crashed into your headquarters tomorrow, what's your plan for business continuity? And some people are lucky like that, but if you are a consumer-facing business, your customers are not going to ask you that question. But the question still stands. If we have a second wave of this viral infection, how are you still going to be able to meet your obligations as a business? How resilient are your processes? Are they audits ready, in the sense that, if we have, imagine COVID-19 was the auditor, the new Deloitte, would you be ready if it came knocking on the door? Perhaps something else to think about is managing your cost base effectively. I think this one's a bit difficult in the sense that, the biggest cost for a lot of companies is labor, right? So I would say explore everything, but try to delay as much as possible the salary side of things. Preserve good relations with your employees, right? Because like we've heard before, and this is not just my words, try and keep the connection with employees and companies. So to hopefully, if we find a cure tomorrow, it's easy to step things up quickly as opposed to then looking for new talent and trying to recruit people.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really important, keeping that medium-term outlook as well.
Exactly. So, think about how you manage your workforce, but be ready for a lot of trade-offs, right? So how can you take advantage of deferrals like bank payments, delaying payments to suppliers, taking receivables haircut, and suspending payments to lessors, and switching from a CapEx to an OpEx model. So staggering payment terms, for example, leasing out equipments that are under capacity, right? If you have more bandwidth, everyone's struggling with bandwidth at the moment. I'm sure I've probably lagged about 2 or 3 times at the moment. So everyone is struggling with bandwidth. If you have more bandwidth, try to lease it out to somebody else in whatever specialty you have. And I'll finish on the final one, which I think was a very good one that I heard, again, from another business leader, is this is a good time to assess your management team. For those who have management teams, how are they reacting in this crisis, right? How are they reacting to their families, to their colleagues, to their teams, to the people that they're responsible for? I think that's a good thing for a lot of businesses to think about, because when we come out of this, you want to go forward and build and hopefully capitalize with a team that not only you believe in, but actually is able to withstand and handle a crisis in a very constructive way that takes your business forward.
Fantastic. I think an interesting question just came in, so I might test you with one of these now. From Dinesh Arora, who's the CEO of Uday Industries. He said, hi, Mr. Peter. We export a lot of our fabric to the UK for many big retailer companies for the winter season. And right now, it was the time of shipments to be dispatched for the upcoming winter season, and the fabrics are ready in stock with us for dispatch. So my question is, how should we bring our case with these companies, and what are the payment terms we should ask of them, as earlier they were with 60 credit days?
So repeat the last part of the question. So they have an export business to the UK, but obviously
Absolutely.
Right now, right? So no one is
sure, exactly. So he's wondering what payment terms should we ask of them, as they previously had 60 days credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ridiculous anyway. So 60 to 90 days is destructive for small and medium-sized enterprises. It's just too much. But unfortunately, you're dealing with retailers with a lot of buying power. It's tricky because if you had more options, you could negotiate better. The problem is these retailers are trying to preserve their cash, right? So I think what I don't want to do is give you a playbook answer, and it's not applicable in a time like this, right? Retailers are getting hit really hard. So I think the least of their concerns will be how to purchase or meet obligations that they had before the crisis. What I would try to say is maybe think about ways you can come to an agreement that allows you to get some staggered payments up front, even if it's delaying some of it till after. But at the moment, your inventory, which is what you have, and your supplies, unless you find a buyer, is not worth anything. So you're trying to get money as quickly as possible in. So my advice would be, where you can, try to negotiate better terms that allow you to stagger it in a sensible way, but also appreciate that these guys they're under pressure just as you are. Maybe try to also look at new buyers, and look at new markets for your fabric, look at alternatives where, yes, you have a finished product, but could it be an input for somebody else or another industry? So I would maybe focus on thinking about those things more so than trying to just get the payment terms in in a way that's favorable for you in the short term.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's really good advice. I'll ask another one of the questions. They're just flying in now. So I guess one from Henawala Henna, who's the export manager of Indo Art International. He said that his biggest question arising at this time is how can we manage export of non-essential goods as lockdown time frames are increasing day by day? Is there any strategy or planning we can do at this time for a solution? I bet a lot of people are facing that issue now.
So manage exports when you are
non-essential goods, yeah.
Essential goods.
It's like probably a very difficult, broad question faced by many.
I think if I knew the answer to that, I'll probably get paid millions. But I don't know. I don't know. Like, if somebody tells you, if the government tells you something's not essential, there's no strategy to get around that. Like, you just have to wait it out. I think maybe what I would do is try to rephrase that question is, forget about your finished products. Think about repurposing your inventory. That's what I would say. Try to strip back as much as possible, delivering non-essential stuff, and try to rethink how you can take materials, raw materials, to create things that are essential. That would be my best advice. I don't think there's any. I mean, if you find one, let me know, please. I'm definitely. I don't think you find that many. So, and preserve the cash.
A really good answer.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I think maybe we got caught up a little bit in the bandwidth. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I missed the last thing you said. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just saying. I think it's a great answer. If there's kind of nothing you can do to, let's say, get around the government restrictions, I think just changing your focus, or to repurposing or something like that, I think it's a really, really nice thing to do. Yeah. In the time that they have. And then one more. You can speak to this one pretty well, I bet. From Sudhakar Sundaraval, Managing Director of Turbo Engineering, or Engineers rather. What are the main problems faced by SMEs in the UK during this lockdown period, and how are they best facing it?
I think the biggest you can't mobilize. So I mean, one of the things that we have here, which is quite handy, is a very strong furlough scheme, right? So a lot of employees who are not able to go to work, or say they're frontline in terms of like retail or manufacturing, where you can't guarantee social distancing measures, they're being furloughed. So that helps. But again, if you can't mobilize your workforce, that's always going to be a big challenge. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge in the UK. Now, bear in mind, the UK is predominantly a services economy, right? So there's very little you can do if you can't physically serve someone. Like, you can't virtually serve them. I mean, in some situations you can, but I can't try to sell you food over a webinar, right? Like, it's very difficult. I can't try to sell you, nice facial products over a webinar. Like, those are things you want to touch, feel. And so until we have that lifted, I think you're always the decline will seem a lot worse than it is for, say, manufacturers who can repurpose their product or portfolio mix, or who can diversify their supply chains to in terms of sourcing from other markets. So that would be the biggest thing. I would say mobilizing the workforce. But I think, accepting the limitation of the UK, most of the businesses here are predominantly services businesses.
Okay, difficult for them for sure. Thanks a million for the questions, guys, and we'll keep touching back on base with those. I think one thing that's really important now, it seems, is structuring costs in a better way to be able to take the kind of hit going on. I wonder, could you speak to that a small bit about what are some best practices for better ways to structure costs right now to prepare for the kind of economic impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of touched on this before. As any company leader knows, the biggest cost of doing business is labor, right? So let's just cut to the chase, right? So labor costs normally account for about 70% of total business costs, on average anyway, including like employee wages, benefits, payroll, related taxes. Maybe something that businesses could think about, and I think this is perhaps more important for SMEs, is think about making people partners, right? Because a lot of times SMEs and business owners of these sort are very protective of their business, right? So, I'm the owner and you work for me. And I'm not saying it's that aggressive, by the way. I'm just saying in terms of the structure. But if you tie, like a lot of you're seeing a lot of this now in try to incentivize executives of big companies. If you tie compensation to incentives that are then tied to business objectives, and maybe in a time like this, business crisis, right? Why can't you think about saying, yeah, you might get less, you take a pay cut because we're trying to save costs, but actually you have a share in trying to grow this business and helping us come out of this on the other side, right? So you're not just thinking about labor costs from a perspective of this person works for me, and if I can't pay them, then I need to get rid of them. But actually this person works for me and they're part of my long-term plan. So how do I incentivize them in a different way? I think that could be something that SMEs should explore, because I don't think SMEs currently do much of that. Startups tend to do that, but that's because they have no money. Another thing is productivity, right? So productivity problems, like there's a hidden cost to underperforming staff. And, I might touch on this again later, but one of the things I was talking to a number of people is how do you measure productivity in the interim, right? Where
absolutely. We just got a question just like that, so you definitely can elaborate on that shortly.
Yeah, like the truth is there isn't any direct way. I mean, what I would say is anything that interferes with productivity, from unnecessary meetings, email overloads, is a cost to your business, right? So focus on offering a range of work areas, structure to employees to maximize productivity. And invariably, you reduce your costs associated with like rigid structures. I mean, in a time like this, okay, so let's take the usual productivity metrics, right? So you would measure your KPIs and things like that will come out monthly, quarterly, or whatever. But that lag is too much in a time like this, right? You can't wait a month, 3 months, because your business could be under by then. So you're trying to find ways to be productive. I mean, the best recommendation I will give right now, it's easier for blue collar workers because those things are still measurable, right? So what's the output? How much are you producing? Wastage data, you can look at things like that. But it's more difficult for creative type of work because, as a consultant, for example, I could be sat in a room for 2 days just thinking with no output, but it doesn't mean I'm not being productive, right? So yeah. How do you measure that? How do you control that? I don't think measure is the right word. I would suggest focusing on cascading responsibility to your leadership team. Because one of the most difficult things to do in a time like this is, measuring team morale, right? So that's where leaders have to step up and take responsibility. That would be the best advice I can give you. If you are in a creative position or run a creative business or service, you have to make it a responsibility of your sub-team leaders to really drive to ensuring the productivity is at a level that, although it's intangible to manage it right now, every day.
Yeah, because one thing I've seen businesses doing, I think it's really nice, is that they've kind of enforced, or not enforced, well, that might be an extreme word, where they've basically got people on board to take a kind of a company-wide, let's say, pay cut for the short term to keep as many staff on the books as possible, so people aren't being laid off in this difficult time. And I think that's a really interesting topic about how do you encourage productivity in that kind of situation. How do you get buy-in from everyone, and get everyone on board? I think I really like the idea of empowering your leaders and giving them that power to inspire the people.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice way. I might go towards some questions because they're
sure,
highly in demand. There's a lot of them coming in now. So I think Sudhakar, we answered your question about the product here. I think Peter explained that really well. Let me see though. Okay, a lot of these, some of these are tend to be towards shipping related. So maybe we can have those email. Just guys as well, if there's anything related to shipping specifically, if you can email that to events@cogoport.com, we can address those directly with our in-house team and software. So we'll definitely present them to Peter, but we can actually help with that a lot too. One question from Minnovation Corp is: do you think countries will look to alternative markets for sourcing, for example, China?
Yeah, you have to, for sure. As in, the one thing I expect to see out of this, right? And this is where SMEs perhaps can have opportunities, is you could argue, and I hope it doesn't happen, but this is almost a first step to globalization that is regionalized. Right? Because switching the lights back on have to align with the ethos of local or regional governments. And that's just the bottom line, right? So the UK, with all due respect, right, doesn't care what India is doing, right? UK is trying to control their own infection rates. And if India decides to do it in a different way, that's India's problem. Vice versa, if, Italy decides to take approaches that doesn't suit how India wants to run its own, management of this viral attack, then why should India care what Italy is doing? So from that perspective, you have to think about critical paths, right, to your supply chain. One of the first exercises, and this is something that I'm doing, working with a client, is think about your critical path and every point of failure in your critical path of your supply chain. Then the next level is think about one or two alternative paths to that. If this dropped, what is my alternative, and what is the cost structure associated with that? And if I don't have alternatives, what is the impact on my cash flow and my balance sheet to be able to prop up that supplier? But I think it's inevitable. You're going to see a lot of regionalization of supply chains, which will invariably increase cost, right? So
goes back to the cost structure question then again, yeah.
Yeah.
And then one from Prakash, the managing director of Burton Industries India. Hi, Peter. We are in the agricultural industry and have a lot of exposure to the UK market. How quickly do you think the market for agriculture is expected to bounce back in terms of priorities? So importing agriculture in the UK.
That's a difficult question. I don't know. I'm not in the agri space. I don't know. What I will say is, I think countries, and this is kind of building on my last point, I think a lot of countries that have outsourced critical capabilities will need a holistic review. So I would expect countries for sure to start to think about building certain capabilities to be a bit more resilient going forward, which is, I'm sure it's not the answer you want to hear, but I think that's what you might see happen. So from that perspective, is you probably need to start looking at new markets and diversifying on that front. If the worst happens, by the way, this is not saying that this is going to happen, but I'm just thinking worst case scenario.
Yeah, and a few people have touched on that actually in the questions. For example, Ardem from PricewaterhouseCoopers did ask do you think that countries may start thinking to reduce their dependency on outside countries? I think you reflected on that there. I know Donald Trump recently tweeted about wanting to bring supply chains back to America and talking about reducing their dependencies abroad. And you probably feel that that's something that globally countries will have to look at.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, forget COVID-19. There's been a push towards nationalization for a number of years now, right? We've had Donald Trump's nationalist rhetoric in the US. Then we've had Brexit over here. Then we've had little uprisings in Europe, right? Is the EU going to stand? You know, this could be a test for the EU as well. Then you have the whole battle between the US and China. I think it's inevitable, right? So this is before COVID-19. COVID-19 has just now exacerbated that. Like nationalization, or at least a push to it, I think it's inevitable. What I would expect to see first, and this is just my opinion, by the way, is I think globalization will first be regionalized. So you'd be looking at a continent basis. So for example, the US might become somewhat of a self-contained, US and Canada, and perhaps South America, self-contained market. Europe might try to become more self-contained, and then you might get the same in Asia, which you kind of already have anyway. Asia is quite self-sufficient. So, you know, countries in Europe and the US will probably rely less on countries in Asia for either cheaper labor or stuff like that. So I think it's inevitable. I think you will get.
And is that something that you expect to continue in the medium to long term?
Sorry, say that again. You broke up a little.
No problem.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that you expect to continue into the medium to long term? Or, I mean, I know it's hard to say because let's say 18 months passes before there's a vaccine and kind of things start getting back to some semblance of normality. Do you think that the supply chains will naturally migrate back to globalized dependency? Or do you think now that this situation will cause countries to put more effort on keeping it that way for the medium to long term?
I think that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, in the short term, there's very little you can do to stand up new supply chains, right? That's impossible. So you just have to accept what you have. In the medium term, then yes, that is possible. In the long term, I think it depends on politics again, right? These are political questions. So how is the rhetoric going to ramp up with the US and everybody else? How is the EU going to stand up? There's so many moving parts. Like that's like the most difficult question to answer. If you say to me, what's my view? And I've said this already, I think what we're going to get in the next, within the next 5 years anyway, is regionalization of supply chains. And if it doesn't happen at the primary level, so the primary level means your critical path, you will see it at the secondary level, which is the alternative path. For example, I might still source from India or from China, but I have very strong relationships with suppliers that perhaps make up about 40% of my book, even though India still makes up 60% of my book. But I can switch very quickly that mix to 80-20 if I came up against a crisis in the next few years. I think that's what you might
guess you're going to see probably a sophistication of business continuity plans then across the board, I guess. That's kind of what it's going to be. Okay. And a question again related to the UK economy from Keshev, the Managing Director of Zapato Exports. What time frame do you think the UK economy will start to recover with respect to import and domestic demand?
What time frame would the UK economy start to
begin to recover? I mean, my initial feeling is I think a lot of people are spouting 12 to 18 months in terms of when a vaccine is released. I guess he's asking when will it start to kind of return to some semblance of normality with respect to, you know, import demands and domestic demand in general.
Yeah, listen, that's like trying to ask how long's a piece of string.
Yeah.
Remember what I said earlier, this is a health problem, right? So we didn't wake up yesterday and decided, oh, let's just shut down the economy because we have nothing better to do. So until we get to a point where we're comfortable with understanding this virus, putting measures in place to combat the virus. I just think these timelines are pointless in my view. They really are. It's a waste of time. Just don't get hung up on that, because you're just going to be following a moving target. You know, there's people who have said the UK economy will open by the summer. Based on what? The death rates are still between 700 to 1,000 a day. So what is that based on? Like, have they found a vaccine that nobody else knows about? So I think just follow the data, right? Let the data guide you. Let the medics guide you, and preserve your cash. Try to wait it out as best as you can. I'm not sure that's an answer that is very helpful, but it's the answer. That's the best answer I can give.
I think it's the best answer available, to be honest. Yeah, it's. I know people are kind of standing on either side of the fence, making big claims about it being open sooner rather than later or later. But I think what your answer is probably the most realistic one in terms of following the data.
And you know, I think something else to think about, just to that point, is, okay, let's say we open the economy, you know, like people like Donald Trump are saying, and then we have a second and a lot more wave. Forget about the economy being open. My question to you as a business is, how are you prepared for that? Because it is possible to have another wave of this. So that's perhaps what I would say focus on, as opposed to when are things going to go back to normal? Like that's a question that I would say we need to move past right now. We need to think about what is our plan if things don't go back to normal in the way we expect it to, and build continuity around that. That's your job as a business leader.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific answer. I think a lot of people are overlooking the idea of a second wave and what that would entail. People are kind of thinking that once this first kind of pandemic is finished, that everything starts to get back to normal. And I think you're absolutely right that people need to be prepared for this extending further, or many, many waves. I think one really good question that came from one of our attendees is, do you think the post-COVID global economy will look more towards sustainable products and services?
Sustainable being what exactly?
I guess environmentally sustainable. So, you know, more kind of global, you know, environmental friendly. If I'm reading the question correctly, so Hale, if you want me to, if I'm reading it incorrectly, please put forward a clarification. But I believe he means sustainable in terms of the environment, and, you know, something that's more, because, you know, everyone talks about the fact that it came from a wet market, and how this is kind of quite a relatively unhygienic kind of environment, and how it's quite wasteful, and maybe we need to move towards a more sustainable, kind of safe long-term solution for these things. So I guess that's what he means. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
I think that's a good question. I will just direct you back to the principle of business, right? So profit is revenue minus cost. So ultimately, sustainability is not built into the profit equation. People will always run businesses based on if they can generate revenues that are greater than their cost. And if the cost of doing business sustainably, especially in the short term, is a lot higher than revenues you can generate, then I just don't see how that would happen. I think sustainability is a great utopia, but I just don't know. I don't think we're anywhere near that place. That's
yeah. And pushed further back in the queue probably by this. And speaking towards more of your investment background, I guess, from Manish, corporate lawyer, mediator, do you think that investors will now look at other countries other than China for investment?
I think they're already doing that anyway. There's a lot
do you think maybe it'll harm maybe the investment market there?
I don't know, because I don't really follow that market closely. I think just thinking about it logically, I don't see why it should, because China is still a very strong growth market. They're still a very strong manufacturing powerhouse, and I think they still contribute about 20% of global GDP, which is still rising, right? So, yeah, I don't think that will happen. Investors will always go where the money is. So
I guess I wonder, you know, when you talk about regionalizing of supply chains, if that will kind of affect China more harshly. Maybe that might speak to why the actual investor market might go down if one country, let's say, the United States, for example, who already have a contentious relationship with China, if they further reduce their trade with China, is that going to, impact the growth market there in China and, potential outlooks?
Yeah, but I guess it works both ways, right? Because, the US as well rely on China for a lot more than perhaps Donald Trump gives credit for. So
sure.
I think it works both ways. You can say, yeah, let's bring back manufacturing to the US, right? Which is fine, but if the cost of that increases, then who's going to bear the brunt of it? Are you going to pass it on to the consumers? If you do that, are they wealthy enough, right? I've just shown you some of the balance sheets that we're going to see balloon in the next 5 to 10 years, just paying for this mess, right? So who's going to pay for all this stuff? Like, ultimately, you still have to think rationally. It's all great to have ideological opinions, but you have to think rationally. The bottom line is, if something costs more than it is to sell, then it's not profitable. And so I'm destroying value. And I hence why I kind of separated the 2 points about, first, think of your critical path and then think of your alternative path. I think what will happen is, I just don't think people are going to cut off China. I just don't think that's going to happen. What will happen is just diversify a bit more and not rely wholly on China.
Fantastic. And then this is an interesting question, actually, from Suvabrata, excuse me if I mispronounced that, Assistant General Manager of Rich Prince Private Limited. Post COVID-19, do you think low margin, high volume businesses would be hit particularly badly?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. That's not an answer he was hoping to hear.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have to assume, I could be wrong, but we have to assume the cost of business is going to go up. So from that perspective, if you're a low margin business and your cost is going up, unless your top line is going up as well, the chances are you're going to get hit. So this is the time to rethink your operating model. This is the time to cut out waste from your processes. This is the time to drive operational efficiency. There's so many things you can explore. The one thing I would say to anyone thinking the same thing along the lines of the question that was just asked is, you have to challenge your business now to do things differently. You have to. Like, there's no get out clause. Unless you want to be subject to exogenous shocks time and time again, fair enough, this is a black swan event, and maybe it doesn't happen again for another 100 years. But unless you want to be subject to things external to your control constantly and you have no control over it, then you have to rethink your business model.
I guess when I think of rethinking the business model and looking at business continuity planning, one of the things that sticks out to me is this idea of, opportunity within that. So I know a lot of people are talking about how this social distancing kind of enforcement has led to people working from home more often. I know people, on a personal level are spending more time with family and different things like that. So in that kind of frame, there's been some positive or some opportunity that's come for the individual based on this. I wonder, do you foresee any opportunities for positive outcomes that come from companies looking at their business continuity planning or restructuring their business? Can some businesses maybe come out of this better, or with certain processes or operations improved because they've been forced to take a hard look at what they have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're forced to make tough decisions, if your back is against the wall, then it's an opportunity to try to rethink how you do things, because you have so many moving parts, right? You have, as you mentioned, your workforce. What are you going to do with them after COVID-19? And what are the costs associated with your workforce at the moment? I know one business owner who is now just literally canned the whole sort of office space that they've been paying for the last 5 years, and it's gone. People are now working from home, and when we need to meet once a week, we hire a venue, right? So that, again, that's a shift from a CapEx spend to an OPEX, right? So what you would normally put as a big outlay, you can now just stream it down and make savings there. Because if you're able to work from home in a time like this, then surely you're able to do it going forward. So there's little things you can do and tweak to get a bit more resilience. But yeah, I guess it's inevitable. You have to look at your business model. You have to challenge how you do things. One thing I would say focus and obsess on is look at customer journeys, right? Because every company in a way, even if you're a B2B business, it doesn't matter. Every company in a way has to become almost Amazon overnight, which is
good luck.
That Amazon, the reason why they're doing so well in this crisis is because they focused on the customer, right? So they got obsessed about the customer, and now they know your journey. It doesn't matter, even though some of that journey was an alternative path before, but now it's become a critical path in a time like this. And I think that's the way you have to think about your business. It's difficult, but it's no longer about a product that you sell, but it's actually about the value that you add to a customer's life or a business's operations. And that's where you should always work back from.
Okay, interesting. I guess we've taken a lot of your valuable time and your expertise so far. I'm just going to put a shout out. If anybody has any last second questions, you can fire them in now. If not, any questions that I didn't get to, if it's shipping or logistics related, you can email it to events@cogoport.com. And even if it's something non-related to shipping, if we didn't get to it, if you could email it to events@cogoport.com, I'll forward it to Peter and I'll get him to have a look at it, and we'll get an answer for you. So I haven't been able. There was some fantastic questions through here, and there was a lot, and I haven't been able to go through them all. And Peter's super busy, as you can tell by his fantastic expertise. He's involved in this a lot, and he's talking to business leaders and CEOs and people around the clock, finding out what's going on. So thank you so much for your time, Peter. I guess if there's any final words or anything, go ahead.
Yeah, let me finish on this one point though, because it's something that I wanted to highlight, and it's something that I've seen work live currently. It's about obsessing over your business capabilities. So managing that carefully to drive agility, right? So business capabilities focus on, this is the clear distinction, and this might help people who are struggling to purpose perhaps where it's required now. Business capabilities focus on what you do or should do as opposed to how you do it, right? So it focuses on the value you provide for a customer. And this was actually the death of American railway companies in the 1930s, because they saw themselves as railway companies as opposed to seeing themselves as transportation companies, right? So how I do it is I provide this big engine that moves people from A to B, or things from A to B, but actually what I do is transport things from A to B. So if I'm able to think outside of how into what, it allows me to think a bit more clearly. And perhaps that's something that businesses can challenge themselves to do. One of the portfolio companies of a client that I work with, they make hygiene products. And even though there's now a bit of a demand shock, what they've done is, because they have the expertise, hygiene expertise, manufacturing hygiene expertise, they were able to repurpose a lot of what they would normally make, whether it be it sanitary products, to making facial masks that are more robust and resilient, right? So they weren't focusing on, how they did something or what they were producing. What they focused on is, we have these expertise. What does the client need? What does the market need? And then they repositioned their resources to be able to take advantage. So I think that's something that businesses can think about as well, is focusing on business capabilities, because if you don't want to get irrelevance and want to allow your organization to be a lot more agile, if you don't think from a capability perspective, then you won't be well positioned to combat perhaps any forces or rivalries, whether it be during just COVID-19 or after.
So I guess it goes back to first principles thinking, and really drilling down to exactly what you do. It's super useful. I might shoot one last question to you, because it goes back to the investing, your investing background. What advice, or would you advise making equity investments of any kind at this time?
That
was a good one to get you at the end.
That's an odd question to ask on yeah, of course, yeah, for sure. I mean, let me ask this fundamental question back to the person who asked the question. When equities were on the rise, right? And I'm assuming he's talking about, or he or she's talking about the stock market. When the stock market was on the rise, were you happy to make an investment? And the answer is most likely yes. So if the answer is yes, then actually your behavior is irrational. Because if you were willing to pay more for something that is exactly the same now, then surely you should be willing to pay less for the same thing if it holds the same value.
Nice.
That would be my thinking. In the short term, the markets. This is not my words. This is Benjamin Graham's words. The markets are a voting machine. In the long term, they're a weighing machine. So your job is to weigh things up and ensure that they hold the value that they claim they hold and discount all the noise. So equities for sure are a good investment, but you have to do the work, right?
Fantastic. I think that's a very, very good, nice way to finish it. Again, thank you so much. I was going to ask you any final words, but I think you touched on it really well, about looking at their processes and drilling down. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Peter. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and it's been actually really enlightening for me as well as everyone else, I'm sure. And I want to thank everyone else for attending. It was really, really nice, really interactive. The questions were fantastic, and it made for a really, really good webinar. So thank you guys again, and hopefully, Peter, maybe we can have you back in a couple of months. Maybe there's some more clarity on the situation. Maybe people have more questions. Maybe things have gotten even more intense, and we need your expertise even more than ever. So hopefully we can all meet again here at some time in the future. And I want to again thank everyone. It's been terrific. And if there's anything you want to finish up on, Peter, go ahead.
Oh, no, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks for everyone who joined. You guys are doing a great job. So just keep it up, and hopefully we all come out on the other side smiling and a bit stronger.
Fantastic. That's really nice. All right. Talk to you guys soon, okay? And thank you again.
Here. Bye.